So hello and welcome to Palestine Deep Dive. Today I'm very happy to be joined by my colleague, Mark Seddon. But Mark Seddon is not only a colleague of mine at Palestine Deep Dive, he is a former UN correspondent for Al Jazeera English TV and editor of Tribune magazine. He has also worked as speechwriter for former United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and serves as director of the UN studies at the University of Buckingham. Today, Mark and I will talk about the UN, but also we will talk about the implications of the election of Donald Trump and what that means for the Palestinians. Mark, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Ahmed. Lovely to see you.
Oh, thank you very, very much. So, Mark, we will talk a bit today about the UN, but let's talk a little bit before that about the election of Donald Trump and what that means for the Palestinians in the short term and in the long term forward.
Well, I mean, one of the reasons Donald Trump was elected, as you know, is that many traditional Democrat voters, especially Michigan, Arab American voters, had enough of the Democrats, had enough of President Biden and didn't vote for Kamala Harris, principally because, as we all know, the Biden administration has continued to support Israel as it's crossed red line after red line after red line. So we know why Donald Trump's been elected. That wasn't just the only reason, but it was certainly one of them. What we seem to know so far is that he did have a call with Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel. The reports we had from that call was that Trump, said to Netanyahu, "I want this over by the time of my inauguration," by which many commentators have taken as a message really to stop the actual fighting in Gaza, to allow him a clean inauguration. But looking beyond this, and I know we will probably go on to discuss some of the individual appointments, I think that in many respects, the darkest hour comes before dawn. And what we're seeing from this president is a man who appears to have learned absolutely nothing from his first term in office, and actually is well disposed to whatever Netanyahu wants to do next in terms of the colonization and the driving out of Palestinians from the occupied Palestinian territories, insofar as they're able to do. So I think that the Trump administration is going to continue, obviously, with the military support of Israel, no matter what, and will be as isolated as it is now, and more so. And I'll just bring just one example, Ahmed. Yesterday, I mean, you all know there was a vote at the General Assembly on self-determination for the Palestinian people. Once again, the United Nations reaffirming 170 votes to 6. So those 6 countries that voted against the recognition of Palestine, self-determination of the Palestinian people, are Israel, the United States, and 2 South American outliers, Argentina and Paraguay, and 2 or 3 Micronesian Pacific states, which are effectively American protectorates. That's how isolated the United States is. And I think the United States is going to be more isolated under Donald Trump.
But Mark, the US is the most powerful country in the world. How important do you think that will play in Palestine? The US can be isolated when it comes to Palestine, but eventually they're the most powerful country in the world and they can make whatever they want. So
yes, I mean, there's 2 ways of looking at this. One is that if we were to believe what the Biden administration was saying and what Blinken was saying, Secretary of State Blinken, all of these red lines that they kept on putting up for Israel, the attack on Rafah that shouldn't happen, the 30 days in which aid had to be increased to 340 trucks a day, and essentially there have been 40 trucks. Each and every time the Americans have asked Netanyahu to do something, he's ignored them. So, of course, you could say, well, how serious were they? Because they never, ever, ever stopped supplying the weapons and the bombs that have been dropped on civilians. So, in one respect, they seem to have little influence over Israel, even if they want to exert it, unless they turn off the military tap. But more broadly, I mean, you do wonder. I mean, clearly, as you and I know, Netanyahu's game plan for a very long time, and nobody can pretend that they don't know that this is the case. He goes to the General Assembly each year and produces the map of Greater Israel and the threat from Iran. And he talks about working with the Saudis. I mean, he clearly wants a US administration, President Donald Trump, to join him with having a war on Iran. Now, the idea that Iran could be some kind of walkover, as Iraq was, is, of course, for the birds, in my view. So I think that, there's a real danger that the might of Trump and the United States, for them, is over-exaggerated. And so they should be very careful what they wish for.
And we also heard that Netanyahu, and not Netanyahu, Bezalel Smotrich is talking about his plans to annex the West Bank, and most likely the people that Trump is appointing as ambassadors to the UN and to Israel are people who want to implement these plans of annexing the West Bank. So my question to you is, what signal does the appointment of Mike Huckabee as the US ambassador to Israel send to the rest of the world?
Well, you could stand back and you could look at Linda Thomas-Greenfield, the current UN ambassador, for instance, who is vetoed, as you know, throughout, used the US veto throughout to frustrate the Security Council over Israel-Palestine, who's accused the UN Special Rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, of being an anti-Semite. We've had the most extreme actual policies from the United States under the Biden administration. So it's going to be a continuum under Trump and his new appointments. As you say, I think there's a difference, though, because under Biden, many of these people pretended that they wanted to do something. Now, there's no pretense anymore. Mike Huckabee and the new UN ambassador, Elise Stefanik, are hardline evangelical Christians. They actually are as extreme as Smotrich and Ben Gvir. They're the same people. Yeah. So this is what we see, and the reality, of course, is that they will be incredibly even more isolated. And what it does mean, I think, is that it's going to be incredibly difficult for the British, for instance, to continue along the lines of supporting whatever America does, and the Germans as well. And don't forget, the Germans have their own election coming up because the German government has just collapsed. So I think things do change at an international level, but I think that things are going to be particularly grim, as we all know, in the occupied Palestinian territories in the immediate period ahead.
And what of the UN and its Secretary General, António Guterres? Has he been an effective leader of the UN?
There are many of us who've been very critical of. It's a very difficult job, of course. Secretary General Guterres came in at the same time as President Trump, his first election, President Trump, and Guterres said at the time, I dealt this impossible hand, because, of course, Trump had very little time for the United Nations. There was a kind of deal done of sorts, that you keep your tanks off my lawn and I'll keep mine off yours. So the UN under Guterres didn't give the US a hard time under Donald Trump the first time around. But now he's been elected again, Donald Trump. I think they're very big question marks as to whether Guterres can actually finish his term, because he has lacked courage in many respects. He's been he really could have been a whole lot more effective, not only over Palestine but also over Ukraine. And it's easy. I know it is easy to say all of this, but over 200 odd former senior UN officials did actually write an open letter critical of Guterres over Ukraine, and I would say that even more critical of his stance over Palestine. That he's just not standing up, being strong enough, and demanding entry to the Palestinian territories, turning up at the Palestinian borders, demanding to be let in. He has been treated in the most appalling manner by the Israelis. Never before has a Secretary General been banned from entering the Palestinian territories. They've got no right to do that. They are breaking international law in doing that. So with utter contempt for the UN, for UNRWA, which they voted to stop actually bringing aid into and helping to that what's left of Gaza function and the rest of the occupied territories. It is extraordinary that Israel has been able to get away with all of this, and it's more the fault of the United States and other countries and the Security Council, but the Secretary General bears some blame himself.
But does he really have power to let a humanitarian aid to come to Gaza? What kind of power does the UN have?
Well, I mean, you know, the old adage is the UN can only be as strong as its member states allow it to be. And right now, at the moment, you've got paralysis at the Security Council, with Russia vetoing everything over Ukraine and America vetoing everything over Israel, Palestine. And that has meant that, you know, the Secretary General at one stage introduced a Chapter 7 resolution, which is actually his own resolution, calling upon all permanent members of the Security Council to stop using their veto and to get behind the UN over Palestine. You know, that didn't work, and so it has moved to the General Assembly. The General Assembly has called for sanctions, and I think that you know, there is a push by Malaysia for a resolution calling for the expulsion of Israel from the United Nations, which would be kind of a bit of a first, actually. Now, I know China and South Africa, and when I say China, I mean Taiwan, have been on the receiving end of the General Assembly in the past, but this is would be quite a big move. But I'll simply say, I mean, with this, expulsion from the UN for Israel for being in breach of international law, for being engaged in genocidal activities, for the forced displacement of civilians, which is a war crime. That expulsion can only happen with the majority vote of the General Assembly and the support of the Secretary General. Now, Israel could be suspended by a simple vote of the General Assembly. It doesn't need the Secretary General's support. So I think they'll be calibrating Malaysia and other countries, which is most likely to pass. But of course, when it comes to aid,
do you think it will pass? Do you think a resolution like that could pass?
I think a vote to suspend Israel could very well likely pass. Absolutely, it's a simple majority. Nobody can veto a General Assembly vote, a resolution. So, and there is also another resolution which can be passed, which has been, but not in its strongest form, which is called Uniting for Peace. It was actually the Uniting for Peace resolution that has called for sanctions against Israel. And we are seeing member states around the world taking sanctions, a whole number of them, as we know, and that will only grow. The isolation of Israel at an international level is growing, and more countries are boycotting Israel. Now, it would be very interesting to see. Let's say, for example, if a vote to suspend Israel was passed by the General Assembly, what would the United States do? The United States might even decide under Donald Trump to suspend itself. Who knows? I know that's a bit of conjecture, but we live in very strange times. But it just does show how isolated both Israel and the United States are.
But what will that mean to the Palestinians if Israel gets suspended from the UN? Will it help in the genocide at least, or give the Palestinians any right or anything?
I mean, I think a lot of people around the world are wondering why it is that the international community cannot put together an intervention force to actually take aid in across the borders. The blue helmets, take them in. And look, the blue helmets and the UN have stood firm in southern Lebanon. They've been attacked time and time again by the IDF, but they've stood firm. And I think what people around the world are wondering is, why doesn't the UN, why don't member states, why can't the Arab League with the UN take in aid? Just do it and see what the Israelis do. because
I,
this current situation it just cannot continue.
I think if you go to Gaza and ask any Palestinian what they think, I think every single Palestinian will ask you the same question. Why can't the world, why can't the international community, why can't the UN force Israel to allow humanitarian aid to Gaza? This is the $1 million question. I don't know what's preventing the world from acting, seeing live stream
It is a $1 million
genocide.
question. The UN itself has learned all these lessons from previous genocides in Rwanda, the genocide of Srebrenica and Garadza in Kosovo and Yugoslavia. Never again, the world said, at the end of the Second World War. We had the Nuremberg trials, where the Nazi war criminals were put on trial. And the question I think a lot of people are asking is, how long do we have to wait? We know probably actually that Netanyahu and Gallant and others will one day face some kind of justice. But what people want to know is what is going to happen now? What is it is stopping? It's not it is actually those member states. They can say, right, we as members of the UN, we are going to take aid into Gaza. They did it before, by the way, in not a very successful way, but even those airdrops have stopped. And never mind the failed pontoon, but absolutely nothing is happening now. And yes.
And Mark, yesterday we saw that a new UN special committee report found that Israel's warfare methods in Gaza are consistent with genocide, including the use of starvation as a weapon of war. And can you tell us what does that mean, and will it have any impact?
Well, again, I think it becomes incredibly difficult for people, for instance, such as the British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer. I was taken by the fact that this week he was asked a question by a backbench member of Parliament. He was asked about genocide taking place. He was asked why his Foreign Secretary David Lammy had said that actually genocide is actually more of a question of numbers, demonstrating a fantastic and possibly quite deliberate ignorance about what genocide actually is. But Keir Starmer said in answer to the MP's question, I really think that it's very poor that you didn't preface your question by mentioning October the 7th and the Hamas attacks first. And then he went on to say, and I know what genocide means. And yes, he does, because both Starmer and Lammy are international lawyers.
Yeah.
Sunak and others, the previous government ministers, at least had the fig leaf of an excuse that they weren't international lawyers, despite the fact that they will be getting plenty of legal advice. So what's stopping Keir Starmer and David Lammy from calling this out for what it is and actually doing something? I think that it becomes, we, of course, in Palestine Deep Dive has been calling this out for a very long time, but it's very important that the international institutions get in behind this and say, this is what is happening. Because then it becomes more and more difficult for governments such as Britain to continue to play this tin ear, this disgraceful game that it's been playing these past months.
Mark, tell us about the history of Israel and the UN. For instance, over the years, do you know how many UN resolutions have been passed against Israel and how many resolutions Israel has violated?
Well, I mean, I wish I had I should have been prepared for that question, and I wasn't. There were obviously one awful lot of resolutions. And of course, the Israelis turn around and say, oh, well, the UN just picks on us. But look, the UN doesn't pick on Israel. The reality is that the UN was midwife to the birth of Israel, as you know.
Of course.
And what was supposed to happen at the birth of Israel was also the birth of Palestine. But it never happened. And, I think that, looking back in history, you can't rewrite history, of course, but there's a friend of mine whose mother worked for Eleanor Roosevelt, who played an enormous role in putting the UN Charter together and was there at the time of the creation of the State of Israel And when she heard the news, she put her head in her hands because she knew what that was likely to mean in terms of what the program of some of the Zionist settlers was, which was to drive out Palestinians from their towns and villages, and the Nakba. And of course, what we're seeing now, Palestinians are saying, is far worse than the Nakba. But look, the reason why the United Nations Security Council and General Assembly have passed so many resolutions on Palestine, the occupied Palestinian territories, is not just because the UN was midwife to the birth of Israel, but not Palestine as was intended, but because the Israelis over the decades have acted without restraint, in contravention of international law, time and time again. And if anybody spends just a tiny bit of time themselves looking at the history, they will see that from attacks in Lebanon before, Shatila attacks. I mean, time and time again, there have been mass killings of Palestinians, and the Israelis have been quite egregious about what they've done, and they don't seem to think that anybody will ever stop them. And if it continues like this, then I think it actually becomes, in the longer term, very difficult for Israel as a country. And there are many Israelis, of course, as we know, who have wanted an end to these conflicts and wars, who have wanted to reach a settlement. There are even some Israelis who, like others, want to live in a secular, democratic country where there's one person, one vote. But the majority, unfortunately, now, being led by this extremist government, are embarked on a course which is absolutely self-destructive in the longer term, because President Trump won't be there forever. Mike Huckabee and the evangelical Christians won't be there forever. And at the end of the day, people have got to live together in a tolerant way. And if we have this extremist settler state with this ideology which is based around apartheid and separation, much as that was in South Africa and in Algeria, but far worse, it won't survive in the longer run.
I know, Mark, that Trump will not be there forever and evangelicals will not be there forever. But unfortunately, we, the Palestinians, are wasting time. We don't have much time left. And now we know that they will annex the West Bank. They are bringing back the settlements to the Gaza Strip. They're enforcing the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians in Gaza. They will go to the West Bank. We know that they will go to the West Bank. They will not let the Palestinians live there in the West Bank. So we don't have time. We, the Palestinians, we don't have time.
No, you don't. You don't. But look, at the end of the day, the number of Palestinians is the same or equal to the number of Israelis. You cannot exterminate a whole people. Look, some of these extremist settlers have this idea that you can just drive 2 million people from Gaza off somewhere. Well, I mean, this hellhole that people are having to live through, the stinking rubble of Gaza, there is nowhere else for them to go. So it's a myth that the Israelis can actually do what they really want to do and get away with it in the longer run. It simply cannot happen. And look, the other thing I think that's really important to bear in mind, you know better than I do, but the Arab Street, right across the Maghreb, right across the Middle East, people are appalled and furious about this. They want this to stop. They really want this to stop. And they look at their governments and they are appalled by the way that their governments, whether it's the Egyptian government or the Saudi government or some of these Gulf sheikdoms, are in the pockets of the US administration. And it's going to become increasingly difficult. I mean, you can forget, for instance, the Abraham Accords being revived. It's going to become very difficult for the Saudis and for UAE and other countries when you have people like Mike Huckabee and Donald Trump's appointments and their evangelical view of the world, which is absolutely the same as the extremist settlers. They won't be able to get their peoples to support this. So at the end of the day, I mean, it's a terrible, terrible thing what's happening right now. I cannot see the Israelis continuing as they're doing for a longer period. I just can't see it. It cannot work. You cannot be a tiny power, even if you've got all the military support from America, constantly antagonizing millions of people who surround you. So the Israelis have got to reach some kind of settlement, which many of them want to do. So, it doesn't answer your question about the short term, but I do think things are moving. Not fast enough. Of course, not fast enough. Things need to happen now. And who, by the way, Ahmed, could possibly have thought a year ago that things could be as bad as they are now? Maybe you did. Maybe you did. But I think most people...
I didn't.
Imagine thinking things could be this bad.
Yeah, and the bad news for Israel is that we Palestinians, we will not just go away.
Yeah.
We will not just go away. Let's go back to the UN and UNRWA, Mark. Now, we know that Israel is at full war against the UN and UNRWA. They're not in... this war is not only with the statements and words, but they have bombed the UN in Gaza. They have bombed the UN schools, the headquarters, and everything. And we know that Palestinians, that the UNRWA, for example, is the pillar of the humanitarian aid to Gaza. Now, Israel wants to close UNRWA and shut it down. What will happen when Israel go ahead with their plan to stop UNRWA from operating the OPT?
Well, I mean, firstly, I'm just to your point about the Israeli attacks on the United Nations, which have been quite deliberate and all the way through. Of course, they were predicated by this claim of several UNRWA workers being part of the Hamas attacks. Those workers were dismissed, by the way, and I don't actually know that the jury is still out on whether they individually were involved. However, the UNRWA has some 13,000, possibly more employees in Gaza alone. And so even if there were half a dozen rotten apples, frankly, this was just an excuse for the Israeli government to do what they've always wanted to do, not just to ban UNRWA, as they're trying to do now, but to kill UN staff. And let's be clear about this. It's not just UN staff they've been killing journalists. They've been killing civilians. They've been using civilians as target practice. They've been shooting children in the head. They've been using drones to fly over children and civilians who are lying there wounded to shoot them. We heard that from a doctor in front of a House of Commons Select Committee yesterday. These are the most egregious attacks on civilians, on the United Nations, on journalists. And all of this should have got governments in the West to move months ago. Any other country, they would have done. But when it comes to UNRWA, what does it mean in practice? Well, we all know that UNRWA is the lifeblood of the occupied Palestinian territories. It provides schooling, provides healthcare. It's provided aid when it's been allowed to get through. But as you were saying earlier, as we know, the Israelis have been using hunger as a weapon, another war crime. So I have to say that without a program from other countries of getting aid in, and there doesn't seem to be one, the Israelis seem to be saying, oh, well, we can employ various private security companies to do this job. Well, good luck to them, because it's not just a question of driving a lorry across a border and going through multiple checkpoints. The situation, as you know, is so desperate in parts of Gaza, in northern Gaza in particular, which frankly is a ghetto. It's reminiscent of the Warsaw Ghetto, where the Germans used starvation and killing to ethnically cleanse and kill the Jewish residents of the Warsaw Ghetto. There isn't a difference really between Gaza, in my view, and the Warsaw Ghetto. So all of this is happening. And I don't see how private companies can get security people, can get in and do the job of UNRWA. I just can't see how it's going to be. It's not me, but this is what most people are saying. Now, the Israelis will say, well, the World Food Programme can step in. But none of this, I mean, UNRWA has taken years to set up. None of this can translate and be set up in a matter of weeks. So, or even days, which is what is needed. This is what the United States said to Israel. There must be 340 trucks a day to deliver the bare minimum to people in the north of Gaza. There have barely been 40. if that. Often there are far fewer. It's deliberate starvation. The Americans' red line has been crossed yet again. Netanyahu knows that they're never serious. And on top of that, the Americans seem to be content that UNRWA is shut down too. They stopped funding UNRWA. They never started funding it again.
What is the future of the UN, Mark? We know that the UN was established after World War II to maintain the international order and world peace, and also to stop new genocides from unfolding. But after 1 year of live stream genocide in Gaza, why should anyone have any confidence in this institution anymore? Should something new emerge?
Well, I mean, something new could emerge, but that would be without some of the current protagonists being involved in the current organization. And it's, you know, the UN was set up to include every sovereign country. You know, it's the whole point of the UN was to obviously peace and security, but try to bring about agreement between different nations and warring forces. And so the UN historically has had to talk to both sides in conflicts. But of course, you know, when it comes to this particular, it's not a conflict, actually. It's not self-defense. This is, as we can see, it's a genocide. The UN can say, well, we have, you know, an exponential growth in wars around the planet. There's a terrible war raging in Sudan, a brutal war raging in Sudan. There's been the colder, slower, but equally bloody war in Ukraine. And people are saying, well, how effective is the UN? Well, it's not the organization, it's the member states. The UN, the veto was never set up to be used as it is by Russia and America, and also Britain when it suits it. It was never, the veto was there to try and encourage peace and security and not frustrate it. So the question is does the UN will survive? Of course it will, and it will continue to do lots of the things that it does well, whether it's inoculation programs. I mean, one of the successes, minor successes in Gaza, it's managed to vaccinate many of the children against polio. All of those sorts of things are going to continue. But I think they're going to have the new Secretary General, whoever that might be, is going to have to take a long, hard look at peace and security and come up with be much more direct and involved and take a harder line against transgressors. And the UN itself has got to be prepared, as it did with right responsibility to protect, when it introduced that to protect civilians against attacks. And it did that in Sudan. Well, that needs to be revived. And it needs to happen very quickly, obviously, but there needs to be responsibility to protect civilians in the occupied Palestinian territories. So, I mean, look, it'd be great to say, yes, you wave your magic wand, you can get a much stronger, better international organization. But I'm afraid that, you know, it is so long as we've got countries, member states that are kind of out of control, it's very, very difficult.
Well, if it's up to me, Mark, as a Palestinian, we Palestinians, we hope we can reach a moment where we no longer need UNRWA, we no longer need the UN, we need a Palestinian state with sovereignty over our own lands and borders, and where we have a freedom to establish our own roads and borders and everything. But until then, we will need UNRWA, we will need the UN to be empowered and safe. Mark, thank you very much for joining me today. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Ahmed.
Thank you.
As Israel attempts to erase the Palestinian people under the cover of darkness, targeting journalists and censoring the press, we must rise from the ashes. At Palestine Deep Dive, we are building a multimedia space where our voices, the Palestinian voices, are always front and center. And right now, we just need 3,000 more of you to join our regular supporters and back our work so we can rapidly expand our output. Help us build the future of journalism. Become a supporter at PalestineDeepDive.com/support. This is 100% independent media powered by you.